They read my name wrong at the Veterans Day ceremony again. Helen Duarte, 52, waitress dog tag still tucked under the collar of my diner uniform. The coffee was burnt the floor cold under my shoes, and someone left 2 mugs on a table meant for 1. What would you have done if silence remembered you first? Walter? Granger didn't care for company, but he came to Maple and Mug every morning like it was his only anchor to the world. The bell above the door gave its usual tired jingle as he stepped inside, brushing a crust of frost from his jacket sleeve. The cafe was warm in that familiar way, steam from coffee pots clouding the front windows, a whisper of jazz drifting from the old radio perched on the pie shelf. The place smelled like cinnamon rolls, scorched toast, and a hint of bleach. He liked that. Honest smells. Walter shuffled to his booth, the far left by the window. It had a view of the sidewalk and the tiny park across the street, now littered with brittle leaves stuck to the frosty ground. He settled in with a sigh, unfolded the local paper, and leaned into the comfort of routine. A new waitress had started a few weeks ago. Quiet type, didn't talk unless spoken to, and even then, only just enough. But Walter noticed she always poured coffee before being asked. As if on cue, she approached with the pot, her steps light but sure. She placed the mug in front of him handle, turned just right, filled it halfway, then gave a polite nod without a word. Her name tag read Helen, printed in simple block letters. Her hair was tied up tight, her shirt sleeves neatly rolled, not a speck on her apron. Walter gave a barely perceptible grunt of acknowledgement, eyes still on the paper. She moved on, weaving between booths, her gait unhurried but intentional. No wasted movement. Marge's voice rang from behind the counter like a tuning fork. Still grumpy, Granger thought frost might chill that sharp tongue of yours. He didn't look up. Still overcharging for burnt toast. She laughed loud and warm. You're lucky I like veterans. Walter allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Across the room, Jimmy sat hunched at the counter, his cap tilted askew, nursing a black coffee and mumbling to the jukebox about how Miles Davis never needed remastering. Jimmy turned slightly when Helen passed by. She moves like someone who's been briefed, he muttered. Marge looked up from wiping a tray. Oh, Lord. Not another theory, Jimmy. But Walter had caught it, too. The way Helen shifted her weight as she turned corners, how her eyes flicked to mirrors and reflective surfaces, not often just enough. She folded napkins in a way that felt practiced, each triangle crisp-aligned like parade formations. Her hands moved with the kind of care you don't teach in diners. Walter didn't believe in reading too much into things. People had pasts. He didn't ask about theirs, they didn't ask about his. That was the deal, spoken or not. Helen moved to the front window and scribbled on a small notepad, probably inventory. She tore off the page, tucked it into her apron pocket, then refilled coffee at the next table. Her shoes were plain black with solid soles, polished but worn. Practical. When she returned to the counter, Marge whispered something that made her smile, small hesitant. Walter saw it from behind the newspaper. It wasn't a waitress's smile. It was something else. Warmer, older, maybe tired. He couldn't tell. He went back to reading the rhythm of rustling paper mingling with the low hum of conversation. Time passed that way, quiet and slow, like maple syrup in November. Later, Helen brought him a second refill without asking. Her hand was steady, the pot tilting smoothly. She said nothing, but for the first time, Walter noticed her eyes. Gray, but not cold. Alert. Not guarded, but watchful. Jimmy piped up again from the counter. Bet she knows how to field strip a rifle blindfolded. Walter didn't answer. He was watching Helen pick up a dropped fork near a bus tub. Her knees bent back straight, motion fluid and efficient. No noise, no hesitation. She placed the fork gently into the bin, stood and walked away without checking to see who noticed. That's not diner training, he thought. That's training period. The cafe door opened, letting in a blast of November air and 2 college kids wrapped in thrift store coats. Helen greeted them with a polite nod, her hand instinctively brushing the side of her apron as if reaching for something that wasn't there. Walter sipped the coffee. It wasn't hot anymore, but he drank it anyway. The warmth wasn't in the cup. As Helen refilled his mug one last time, Walter sees her pause just briefly as if checking a room for exits. Walter didn't believe in fate, but the way Helen knew his coffee preference before he opened his mouth, that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Snow had started early that morning, the kind that barely stuck but reminded everyone to dig their boots out of the closet. It whispered against the cafe windows, now soft as breath. Inside Maple and Mug, the tables filled slowly, mostly with regulars. The radio, low as always, played an old Benny Goodman tune, the clarinet weaving between the clinks of mugs and silverware. Helen poured Walter's coffee before he even settled into the booth. "Banana bread's fresh," she said, setting a slice beside the mug. "On the house." He looked up, brow slightly furrowed. "That's so." She didn't smile, just gave a polite nod and moved on. Jimmy wandered in a few minutes later, wrapped in a patched denim jacket that might have been older than Helen. He carried a folded piece of newsprint and a tea bag in his coat pocket. Ignoring the counter, he slid into the opposite side of Walter's booth and waved at Helen with 2 fingers. "She lets you sit here now," Walter muttered. Jimmy chuckled. "Nobody lets me do anything. I'm a free spirit with old knees." He pulled out the clipping, smoothing it flat. "Saw this in yesterday's Times-Union. Thought of you." The headline read, "Vets Who Never Marched." Subheading, Medics. Cooks and Quiet Heroes of the Longest Wars. Walter scanned it slowly, fingers tracing phrases without realizing. They held pressure on wounds. Whispered, "Last rites." Watched others get medals. The words stirred something beneath his ribs. Something quiet and raw. From behind the counter, Marge barked, "You ever gonna bring someone in here besides that newspaper?" Walter didn't bother to look. "What for? I've got Jimmy now." Jimmy raised both eyebrows. "Well, I do talk back." A chair scraped loudly across the floor as a teenage boy pulled it out too fast. Helen, wiping the counter, flinched not dramatically. Just a small reflexive twitch. Her eyes darted briefly to the door, then dropped back to the rag in her hand. Walter saw it, saw the way she recovered not just physically but emotionally. Like snapping back to protocol. She poured a coffee for another customer with her other hand steady and smooth. "She's jumpy," Jimmy said, sipping hot water through pursed lips, "but not in the way people expect." Walter kept his eyes on his banana bread. "What way's that?" Jimmy shrugged. "The kind of jumpy you get when you've cataloged every bad exit in a room before the jukebox finishes its first song." Walter didn't answer. But the words lingered, like the way she folded napkins, or how she timed her breaks with eerie precision. Marge had said something about it yesterday. "Girl's got a clock in her bones," Marge grumbled now from the kitchen doorway. Her schedule's more military than the Veterans Day parade. Helen, back at the counter, gave a soft shrug. "Makes the day go faster." Walter turned toward the window. The snow outside had thickened into fine grains. They didn't fall so much as drift the way sand drifts across a road, quiet and unrelenting. He let his mind wander against his will to a dusty tent outside Kirkuk. A medic, their voice firm but low, a palm pressing against his shoulder, the scent of iodine and blood mingling. He hadn't remembered her face. Just the name barked between gunfire. Duarte couldn't have been. Too long ago. Too many people, too many ghosts. Helen moved through the cafe like a conductor who hated attention. She nodded to customers, refilled sugar holders, cleared plates without clatter. Her focus never broke, but it never lingered either. When the late morning lull settled in, Helen disappeared into the back room. Walter, almost without meaning to, leaned slightly out of the booth to see. The curtain behind the prep counter rippled as she stepped inside. In the sliver of movement, he caught a glimpse Helen removing her apron with one hand, the other reaching beneath the collar of her sweater. A thin, silver chain glinted in the low kitchen light, then vanished just as quickly as she adjusted her layers and turned away. It wasn't jewelry. It was habit. Ritual. A private tether. Walter sat back slowly, eyes narrowing. He didn't know what it meant, not yet, but something was layering itself underneath the surface of maple syrup and clinking mugs. He glanced back at Jimmy, who was now muttering to his tea like it owed him an answer. Walter folded the newspaper closed not on the last page but on the obituaries. Walter didn't mean to say it aloud, but the moment she leaned to refill his cup, it slipped out Duarte. Friday morning came with a dull gray sky that never quite woke up. The wind chased the last of the maple leaves down the sidewalk, their colors already muted by the cold. Inside, maple and mug warmth clung to the windows in a fog of breath and coffee steam. The usual hum of conversation was gentler today, like the town itself was beginning to pause for the weekend ahead. Helen moved through the cafe with her same quiet rhythm. Apron, tied snug hair, tucked back shoes that never squeaked. Walter had come earlier than usual just to sit without reason, or maybe with too many. He'd been folding and unfolding his napkin eyes following the brass flag stuck into the salt shaker on the corner table reserved for the Veterans Day display. Old black and white photos, names typed on note cards, a small candle unlit. Helen approached with the pot, same as always. He knew she'd bring it. She always did. But this time, as she leaned forward, the collar of her sweater shifted just slightly. And there it was, a dog tag. Not fancy, not hidden under any charm or necklace, just a thin silver chain and a tag that caught the light for a single second. H. Duarte, U.S. Army, 10th, Med-Evac, Fallujah. The words hit Walter like a second heartbeat. His coffee sat untouched. His hands slowed, one resting lightly on the edge of the table. For the first time in a long time, he didn't move. Helen straightened up, placing the pot down beside the creamer. She didn't look at him, but something in the air she knew. Walter took a breath shallow, then, "Were you in Anbar 04? She was still, briefly. His voice stayed low, but something beneath it cracked like old paint. Someone pulled me out. I never saw her face, but she said, 'Breathe. You're not done.'" Helen didn't flinch. She only watched him, eyes steady like leveled glass. She gave the smallest nod. Not agreement, not denial, just acknowledgement, the kind that required no elaboration. He looked at her again, not like a man looking for answers, but like one realizing he'd seen them all along. Every precise movement, every sidestep toward silence. "I thought she died," he said, voice softer now like a whisper given to memory. Helen's eyes lowered briefly, not out of shame, but something else. Then she said, just loud enough. Parts of her did. From the back, a clatter of metal. Marge washing pans. Through the pass-through window, her eyes flicked up, met Walter's, then moved away. She didn't speak, didn't interrupt. Jimmy, who had been sipping quietly at the far counter, stood. Time for some air, he mumbled more to himself than anyone. He left his tea, unfinished coat hanging open in the cold. Walter and Helen remained. The silence between them didn't demand filling. It had its own weight, dense but not heavy like soil after rain. Walter reached for his napkin again, this time not to wipe his hands or twist it nervously. He folded it once, then again. His hands were steady now. He laid the square flat on the table. "Do you ever talk about it?" Helen's eyes didn't shift. She spoke quietly, evenly, not with people who lived. Walter arrived earlier than usual, newspaper folded under his arm, but his seat was already taken by his own hesitation. The door gave its familiar chime, but no one looked up. It was too early for most, the sky still smudged with pre-dawn gray. Outside, the streets glistened with a thin sheen of melted frost, and the stubborn leaves clung wet to the soles of his boots. Walter stood for a moment just inside the entrance, rubbing his hands together not for warmth, but for courage. The booth near the window, the one he always claimed, sat empty, but he didn't go there. Not today. He slid into the booth across the aisle instead, facing it like he needed the distance to think. The cafe was hushed. Jazz played low, same as every morning, but even the saxophone seemed reluctant to speak. By the window, a small table had been set with a simple arrangement, folded flags, framed photos, candles in glass jars. A flyer hung askew above it. Veterans Memorial Dedication, Sunday City Green, 10 a.m. His own name was on the list. He hadn't planned to go. Helen brought him his coffee without a word. No slice of banana bread today. Just the mug handle turned the way he liked it, placed gently on the table. Her eyes flicked to his for only a second, then down. And then she moved on. Walter didn't read the paper. He just stared at it, fingers resting on the folded front page. His mind wasn't on headlines. It was on names. Etched names. Not on stone, but in moments like the one he couldn't forget. That name on the dog tag, the voice in the dust, the way her hands had pressed down on his ribs while he gasped for air that night. Hands that didn't tremble. Hands that kept him tethered to life. He looked at Helen's back as she cleaned the counter, wiping slow circles, stacking clean plates like someone who had done it all before somewhere else. Somewhere far. He reached for a napkin. It wasn't a grand thing, just a few words written slowly. Then he folded the paper triangle the way soldiers do, with flags, corners, tucked edges neat. He placed it under the warm mug, waited one more minute, then left without saying anything. Helen found it after he was gone. She didn't open it at first. She held the folded napkin lightly between two fingers like it might evaporate. Then she read the note. You saved more than my life. You gave me years. Thank you. She didn't smile, didn't frown, just stood still for a long while. Then, without drama, she placed the triangle carefully into the bottom of her tip jar beneath the bills and change. Not as something to be discarded, but as something to be kept. Marge Flower on her apron and a pie tin in hand watched the whole thing from behind the counter. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Late in the afternoon, as shadows stretched long across the linoleum floor, the bell above the door chimed again. Jimmy stepped in carrying a worn brown paper bag. He didn't head for a booth. He walked straight to Helen and handed it over. I've carried this long enough, he said. I think it belongs somewhere steady now. She opened the bag slowly. Inside, folded and pressed, was a small flag patch. The colors faded, but the stitches tight. A corner of it was frayed but intact. Jimmy gave a soft nod, then left without sitting. That evening, just before locking the door, Helen stood by the window looking out at the empty street. She reached up, fingers touching the silver chain beneath her collar. She paused. Then she pulled the tag free, letting it rest against her chest, visible now, not hidden. At City Green, folding chairs sat in crooked lines and flags moved slow in the wind as if waiting for someone still deciding to show up. The cold had a respectful edge to it. Not the biting kind, just enough to make you tuck your hands into your sleeves, enough to draw color into the cheeks. The kind of morning that made breath visible and silence more honest. Walter walked toward the field, his steps steady. His jacket, the same one that hadn't seen light in nearly a decade, fit snug over his shoulders. The pin above his heart, a small gold star surrounded by a wreath, caught a sliver of sun just breaking through the clouds. He didn't wear a hat. He wanted the wind on his face. He wanted to feel it. Rows of folding chairs were already filling. Children in red, white, blue scarves waved miniature flags at nobody in particular. A brass band of high schoolers fidgeted with instruments, reeds, and valves clinking like teeth before a speech. Beside the podium stood framed black and white photographs, names etched on cardstock beneath smiling young faces frozen in uniform. At their feet, wreaths of plastic poppies and chrysanthemums. And just to the side, a table with no chairs, just a single glass of water, a plate, and silverware turned downward. Walter took a place near the front second row. Jimmy was already seated nearby, mini flag in hand, held not like a decoration, but like a memory. Jimmy didn't speak. He just gave Walter a small nod, eyes forward. The mayor stepped up to the mic. Young, crisp voice. She stumbled on one name, apologized, then carried on. A teenage girl sang the anthem. Her voice shook at first, but steadied by the second verse. The crowd didn't sing along. They listened. Hands over hearts, no phones in sight, just the stillness of shared remembrance. Helen stood at the back. She hadn't planned to come. But something about the way the tag had rested on her collar that morning, half seen, half kept, felt like a nudge. She wore her gray coat buttoned to the top, no makeup. Her hands remained tucked into her pockets. When the anthem ended, she didn't move, just observed, still quiet, like always. The names began, each read carefully by a local high school teacher voice, dry but reverent. There were pauses, a few muffled coughs, a few sniffles, then, unexpectedly. And this year we remember not only those who wore stripes or bars, but those who bore no rank, only wounds, only weight. In honor of the unnamed medics and field personnel, our quietest warriors. Helen's shoulders shifted. Walter didn't turn to look. He just nodded once. It was small, barely a movement, but it was there. Helen, still near the tree line, lowered her head slightly. No one clapped. The air didn't need it. A gentle gust passed through the flags, lifting their edges as if they too were exhaling. Marge worked the cider stand near the back, her apron dusted with powdered sugar from the morning's apple fritters. She slipped away just long enough to approach Walter. He didn't notice until he felt the tug at his coat pocket. She'd placed something folded there. "Some stories should walk side by side," she whispered, and walked off before he could reply. Taps began. The lone trumpet pierced the stillness. Not loud, just pure. Children grew quiet. The leaves barely rustled. Time slowed. Walter let the sound pass through him. His eyes drifted across the crowd. And then he saw her. Helen stood still, but not stiff. The dog tag glinted just below her collar. Not flaunted, just not hidden. Their eyes met. Neither smiled. There was no wave, but something passed between them. Something warmer than the cider, older than the chairs or flags or flyers. It was the silence that changed softer now, no longer shielding, but sharing. The program ended. People clapped politely. Some lingered. Others folded their chairs. Walter stayed for a while, then finally turned and walked. The wind picked up. A napkin from the cider table danced down the path. Children's voices rose again. The town resumed itself. Walter moved slowly down the sidewalk, past the bank, past the pharmacy with its window full of early holiday lights, past the florist where a single candle burned near a framed portrait of a young Marine. He turned the final corner toward Maple and Mug. The cafe was closed, of course. The ceremony had drawn them all outside. But as Walter passed the window, he paused. Inside, near the usual booth, a table was already set. 2 mugs. Waiting. Helen arrived before opening. She unlocked the door, brewed 2 pots, and set out the mugs like she wasn't sure who would fill them. The key turned with a faint metallic click echoing softly in the stillness. The cafe was cold, at first the kind of cold that hugged your calves and settled on your knuckles, but the heat came up quickly. She moved like she always had, measured quiet, but today she paused between steps. Just slightly. Just enough to feel the difference. She didn't turn on all the lights. The soft ones over the counter would do. Through the frost-rimmed windows, morning sunlight broke gently onto the tables. The flags from yesterday's ceremony still hung near the coat rack, creased at the edges, but proud. The air smelled faintly of clove and maple syrup clinging to the wooden beams like memory. 2 mugs. One at her usual spot near the register. One across from it. She didn't know why she set them both. Or maybe she did. At 7:04 the door chimed. Walter walked in without knocking. He wore the same jacket as the day before, but no pin today. Just the weight of the moment. His walk wasn't stiff, but deliberate. He looked around, nodded once, and took the seat she'd quietly left for him. She poured both mugs full. They didn't speak right away. The only sounds were the quiet clink of ceramic, the hiss of the warm plate beneath the carafe, and the creak of the wooden booth as he settled in. After a moment, Walter reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded photo. It had been worn at the corners, smudged in one place, creased where fingers had pressed over time. He slid it across the table. A stretcher. A young man on it, his face pinched, eyes closed. Blood in the dirt. And beside him, caught in motion, a medic. Blurred, moving fast hands on his chest. Even in the blur, the braid of her hair was visible beneath the helmet strap. "This is you, isn't it?" he asked. Helen studied it, blinking once, then twice. She nodded slowly. "I didn't know anyone kept the picture," she said, voice steady. Walter's fingers tapped the rim of his mug once before he answered. "I didn't know anyone survived that day." She reached down, pulled a small box from beneath the counter and placed it in front of him. Plain cardboard. No label. He opened it carefully. Inside, 2 old patches, sun-faded but intact. A folded field report, edges yellowing. And a scarf frayed olive green, the kind you tie when sandstorms threaten more than your eyes. "We didn't keep souvenirs," Helen said quietly. "Just reminders." Walter didn't touch the scarf. Not yet. But he looked at it a long time. They drank their coffee in near silence. Once or twice Helen refilled his cup without asking. Once he offered the sugar packet before she reached for it. They didn't talk about war, or pain, or memory, but it was all there tucked in the pauses between sips and glances. Outside, the town began to stir. A woman passed with her dog waving through the foggy glass. A man in a flannel coat slowed as he walked past, then stood still for a beat, raised 2 fingers in a quiet salute. Walter didn't wave. Neither did Helen. They didn't need to. The world continued gently, without asking for explanation. When the mugs were empty, Walter reached for his coat. Helen stood, walked with him to the door. The bell above it waited ready. She paused, one hand on the frame. "I make coffee at 7, she said. "You coming back tomorrow?" Walter smiled, small but full. "Only if there's banana bread." The cafe was never about coffee alone. It was a quiet place where 2 lives shaped by war and silence found their way back to a kind of peace. Sometimes the gentlest acts, refilling a mug, folding a napkin, hold the deepest truths. Kindness doesn't need applause, and it never asks for recognition. Like a porch light on a foggy morning, it simply waits for someone still deciding to show up.